The morning started like many others at the small roadside diner just off the highway. The sun had barely climbed over the rooftops, and soft golden light filtered through the wide front windows. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee and warm pancakes floated through the air. Plates clinked softly, chairs scraped across the floor, and quiet conversations mixed with the low hum of a radio playing old songs behind the counter. For the people who worked there, mornings were always busy but familiar. Regular customers arrived around the same time every day. A few truck drivers sat near the windows, finishing breakfast before heading back onto the road. Two elderly men argued playfully over the newspaper at the counter. A young couple shared a plate of toast while checking their phones. Moving quickly between the tables was a young waitress who had already been working for several hours. She carried a coffee pot in one hand and a small notepad in the other. Her steps were quick but careful as she greeted customers, filled cups, and kept the morning running smoothly. Many of the regular customers knew her well. She always greeted people with a warm smile and remembered small details about them. One customer liked extra cream in his coffee. Another always asked for toast instead of biscuits. She never forgot. The diner was not a fancy place, but it had something more important. Felt welcoming. People came there not only for food but also for the quiet comfort of routine. The front door opened with a soft chime, and a cool breeze slipped inside. At first, no one paid much attention. New customers walked in all the time, but a few heads slowly turned. A man had stepped through the door, moving slowly but carefully. One hand held a sturdy cane, and the other rested briefly against the door as he paused to steady himself. Beside him walked a large dog. The animal stayed close to the man's side, calm and alert. His posture was steady and focused, like it understood its job very well. The man looked older than most of the morning customers, though not elderly. His shoulders were broad, and even with the careful way he walked, there was something about his posture that suggested strength. The kind that came from years of discipline rather than exercise. His clothes were simple. A dark jacket, worn boots, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. But the thing many people noticed first was the patch sewn onto the side of the dog's vest. Service dog. A few quiet whispers moved through the diner. Not out of disrespect but curiosity. The waitress near the counter noticed them almost immediately. She had learned to watch the room carefully while working. A new customer could mean a new order, a new request, or sometimes someone who needed a little extra attention. She walked toward the entrance with her usual calm smile. Up close, she could see the man's movements were careful and controlled. Every step with the cane looked practiced, like he had learned how to move this way after a long time. The dog stopped beside him and sat without being asked. The man looked around the diner for a moment. His eyes moved slowly across the room, almost as if he was studying it instead of simply looking for a table. Then his gaze met the waitress. His voice was calm when he spoke. "Can I take here?" His words were simple, and he gently pointed toward an empty table in her section. The waitress nodded immediately. "Of course," she said kindly. She stepped aside so he could move forward more easily. The dog rose quietly and walked beside him again as he made his way toward the table. The cane tapped softly against the floor with each step. Some customers returned to their meals, but a few continued watching with quiet interest. The waitress pulled the chair out slightly to help him sit down. "Take your time," she said. The man lowered himself into the seat carefully. It was clear that even sitting required effort. The dog settled beside the table, lying down with its head lifted. The waitress picked up a menu and placed it gently in front of him. "Can I get you some coffee to start?" she asked. The man nodded once. "That would be good." She poured a fresh cup from the pot she carried and placed it on the table. Up close, she noticed something else. A small metal pin attached to the man's jacket. It was shaped like a trident. She had seen one before in a documentary. It was the symbol worn by Navy SEALs. The realization made her pause for a brief second. She didn't say anything about it. Instead, she simply smiled again. "I'll give you a minute to look at the menu." He nodded in appreciation. "Thank you." She walked back toward the counter, continuing her work, but she found herself glancing back once or twice. The dog remained completely still beside the table, perfectly trained. Several minutes passed. The morning noise continued around the diner. Plates were served. Coffee was refilled. Conversations carried on. But something changed. It happened quietly. The dog's head lifted higher. His ears turned slightly. His body stiffened. The change was small but noticeable. The dog slowly stood up beside the table. At first, the veteran didn't react. He simply held his coffee cup and looked down into it thoughtfully. But then he felt the slight tension in the leash. He looked down at the dog. The animal wasn't looking at him. It was staring across the diner, completely still. The waitress noticed it too. She had just finished placing a plate of eggs in front of another customer when her eyes moved toward the table again. The dog had not moved from its spot, but something about its posture had changed. It was alert now, focused, the kind of focus that didn't belong in a quiet breakfast diner. The veteran followed the dog's gaze. His eyes slowly moved across the room until they landed on a booth near the far wall. A man sat there alone. He had arrived earlier and had barely spoken to anyone. Most people had not paid attention to him, but the dog had. The animal remained perfectly still, watching. The waitress walked over with a small notepad. "Ready to order?" she asked gently. The veteran looked up at her for a moment before answering. "Give me another minute." She nodded, but she noticed something in his expression. He wasn't looking at the menu anymore. His eyes had quietly shifted toward the same booth the dog was watching. The dog did not bark. It did not growl. It simply stood there, frozen in place. And for the first time since he walked into the diner, the veteran's calm expression had changed slightly. Not fear, not anger, just awareness. The kind that comes from someone who has learned to listen carefully when a trained dog suddenly decides something is not right. The waitress walked back toward the counter again, but now she felt it too. A strange tension had slipped into the room. Most customers hadn't noticed yet. They were still eating, talking, laughing. But the veteran and the dog were watching the same corner of the diner. And whatever the dog had sensed had already frozen the entire mood of the room without anyone fully understanding why. The waitress continued moving between tables, but the feeling in the diner had quietly shifted. It was not something loud or obvious. Most people were still focused on their meals, their phones, or their conversations. Plates clinked against the counter. The coffee machine hissed softly, and the radio played an old country song in the background. But at one small table near the middle of the room, the atmosphere had grown different. The service dog was still standing beside the veteran's chair, completely still. Its eyes were fixed across the diner toward the far corner booth. The veteran noticed every detail of the dog's posture. Years of working with trained animals had taught him to read the smallest signals. The dog was not frightened. It was not excited either. It was alert, very alert. That kind of alertness usually meant the dog had noticed something unusual. The veteran slowly set his coffee cup down on the table without making much noise. His movements were calm, controlled. The kind of calm that came from someone who had learned to stay steady in tense moments. He gently rested his hand on the dog's back. The dog didn't move its eyes from the corner booth. "Easy," he said quietly. The dog's tail gave one small movement, but its body stayed firm. Across the diner, the man sitting alone in the corner booth shifted slightly in his seat. He had a half-finished plate of food in front of him, but he wasn't eating anymore. Instead, he seemed to be looking down at the table, tapping his fingers lightly against the surface. The waitress returned to the veteran's table with a small smile. "Have you decided what you'd like?" The veteran looked up at her, then glanced briefly at the dog. "Just some eggs and toast," he said calmly. She wrote the order down quickly. Coming right up. As she turned to walk away, she noticed the dog again. His focus had not changed. "Your dog seems very serious," she said with a soft laugh, trying to lighten the mood. The veteran gave a small smile, but his eyes stayed thoughtful. "He takes his job seriously." She nodded, though she was not sure what that meant exactly. Service dogs were trained for many things. Some helped people walk. Some helped with medical alerts. Still, something about the dog's behavior made her glance toward the corner booth. The man sitting there looked ordinary at first glance. Dark jacket, baseball cap, a small backpack resting on the seat beside him. But something about his posture seemed tense. His shoulders were slightly raised, like he was uncomfortable. The waitress shook the thought away and headed toward the kitchen window to place the order. Behind the counter, the cook slid a plate of pancakes onto the serving ledge. "Busy morning," he said. "Always," she replied, but her mind briefly returned to the dog. Back at the table, the veteran slowly turned his head again toward the corner booth. He did not stare openly. Instead, he glanced occasionally, the same way someone might casually scan a room. But inside his mind, old habits had already begun to wake up. Years earlier, before the cane, before the quiet diner mornings, he had lived a very different life. A life where paying attention to small details mattered. A life where trained dogs worked beside soldiers on difficult missions. And when those dogs reacted to something, people listened. The service dog shifted its weight slightly, still watching, still silent. The veteran gently tapped the dog's side. "Stay." The dog obeyed immediately but did not relax. Across the diner, the man in the booth reached down and adjusted the backpack beside him. The movement was quick, almost nervous. He glanced around the room briefly. For a moment, his eyes passed over the veteran's table. Then he quickly looked away. The veteran noticed, not because it was obvious, but because the man avoided looking back a second time. The waitress returned a few minutes later carrying a coffee pot. She refilled the veteran's cup. "You'll have your food in just a minute," she said. "Thank you." She leaned slightly closer to the table and whispered quietly, "Is everything okay?" The veteran looked up at her. For a second, he seemed to consider the question carefully. "Yes," he said calmly. Then he added something else. "Just paying attention." She wasn't sure what he meant by that, but something in his tone made her nod slowly. As she walked away again, she noticed the dog had not moved since the moment it stood up. Customers nearby had started to notice as well. One of the truck drivers near the window glanced over. "That dog hasn't blinked in 5 minutes," he joked to his friend. His friend looked over briefly. "Must see something interesting." They laughed quietly and returned to their breakfast. But the tension continued to build slowly. The veteran leaned back slightly in his chair, though the cane rested against the table within reach. His eyes moved around the diner once more. Every table, every customer, every exit. Old training habits. The service dog's ears twitched. The man in the booth reached into his jacket pocket. For a moment, the veteran's attention sharpened. But the man only pulled out his phone. He looked at the screen quickly, then placed it back down on the table. Still, he did not return to eating. The waitress brought the veteran's plate a few minutes later. Eggs, toast, a small side of potatoes. She placed the plate down carefully. "Anything else you need?" The veteran glanced once more toward the corner booth. Then he looked back at her. "No," he said quietly. "This is perfect." She smiled and walked away again. The veteran picked up his fork, but he didn't start eating right away. Instead, he studied the dog again. The animal's breathing was steady, but its focus had not changed at all. That level of attention meant something had triggered its instincts, something it recognized, something important enough to keep watching. Across the diner, the man in the booth shifted again. He looked toward the door briefly, then toward the windows, then down at the backpack beside him. The veteran noticed the pattern. Person looking for exits. A person checking their surroundings. It did not automatically mean something bad, but it was enough to keep the veteran alert. The waitress continued working, but she could now feel the tension too. She walked past the veteran's table again while carrying a tray of drinks. The dog was still standing, still watching. She slowed slightly. "Is he always like that?" she asked softly. The veteran answered without looking away from the room. "No." That one word made her pause. She looked at the dog again, then toward the booth. Something about the situation now felt heavier. Not dangerous. Not yet. Just uneasy. The man in the booth suddenly stood up. The movement caught several people's attention. He adjusted his jacket and picked up the backpack. For a moment, the service dog's body became even more rigid. The veteran gently placed his hand on the leash. "Easy," he whispered again. The man hesitated beside the booth like he wasn't sure where to go next. Then he sat back down again. Several customers chuckled softly at the strange moment. But the veteran did not laugh. His instincts had grown sharper now, and the dog had not relaxed even once. The waitress returned to the counter and leaned toward the cook. "Something feels strange today," she said quietly. The cook raised an eyebrow. "Strange how?" She glanced toward the veteran and the dog. "I'm not sure yet." Back at the table, the veteran finally took a bite of his food. But his attention remained divided. Between the meal in front of him, the dog beside him, and the man sitting alone across the diner. Outside, a car drove past on the highway. Inside, the quiet morning continued. But beneath the normal sounds of breakfast and conversation, something else was building. Something only two in the room seemed to fully notice. A trained veteran, and a dog that had not taken its eyes off the same man since the moment they walked in. The veteran continued eating slowly, but every movement around the diner was clear in his mind. Years ago, paying attention to small details had been the difference between safety and danger. Even now, long after leaving that life behind, the habit never truly disappeared. The service dog stood beside the table without moving much. Its body remained calm, but its eyes stayed fixed on the same corner booth. The veteran placed another small piece of toast in his mouth and chewed quietly. To anyone watching, he looked like an ordinary customer finishing breakfast. But inside, his mind was working. Across the diner, the man in the booth shifted again. He looked toward the front door, then toward the windows, then down at the backpack beside him. The veteran noticed the pattern repeating. People often looked around in public places. That alone meant nothing. But the man seemed restless, almost uncomfortable. The service dog slowly lowered its head slightly, but its eyes remained locked in the same direction. The veteran gently touched the dog's shoulder. "You see something I don't?" he whispered quietly. The dog's ears twitched. That was enough for him. He didn't assume anything bad was happening, but he trusted the dog's instincts. The waitress returned with a coffee pot again, making her usual rounds. When she reached the veteran's table, she paused for a moment. "More coffee?" she asked softly. He slid the cup slightly forward. "Please." As she filled the cup, she glanced down at the dog again. It still hadn't relaxed. "You weren't joking earlier," she said quietly. "He really does take his job seriously." The veteran gave a small nod. "He's trained to notice things most people miss." Her curiosity grew. "Like what?" He took a sip of coffee before answering. "Changes. Behavior. Smells. Sounds." She looked across the diner toward the booth without making it obvious. "You mean like that guy over there?" The veteran didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply looked back down at his plate. "I didn't say that," he replied calmly. But the waitress understood what he meant. She walked back toward the counter, though now she felt a stronger sense of awareness. The man in the booth seemed normal at first glance. But now that she paid closer attention, she noticed the same things the veteran had. The constant shifting, the quick glances around the room, the untouched food sitting on the plate in front of him. Behind the counter, the cook slid another order toward the serving window. "You look like you're thinking about something," he said. She nodded slowly. "Just watching the room." He laughed lightly. "That's your job." But she didn't laugh. At the veteran's table, the dog finally sat down again. For a moment, the veteran thought the tension might be easing. But then the dog's ears lifted again. The focus returned immediately. The veteran slowly leaned back in his chair and glanced toward the booth again. The man had taken out his phone. He typed something quickly, then put the phone back in his pocket. The backpack still sat beside him on the seat. The veteran studied the bag briefly. It looked ordinary, but something about the way the man kept touching it made him curious. The dog gave a quiet breath through its nose. Not a bark, Not a growl. Just a small signal. The veteran recognized it instantly. That was a scent alert. His attention sharpened. Service dogs trained in certain areas could recognize many things through smell alone. He didn't jump to conclusions, but the signal was enough to make him more cautious. He reached down and gently rubbed the dog's neck. "Good boy," he whispered. Across the diner, a truck driver stood up from his table and walked toward the counter to pay his bill. As he passed the corner booth, the man sitting there shifted again, pulling the backpack closer to him. The movement caught the veteran's eye immediately. The truck driver didn't notice anything unusual. He simply paid, nodded to the waitress, and walked out the front door. The bell above the door chimed again as it closed. The veteran watched the door for a second before looking back toward the booth. The man was staring at the table again. The waitress approached the booth carefully. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked politely. The man shook his head quickly. "No, I'm fine." His voice sounded tight. She noticed the plate in front of him was barely touched. "Would you like a box for the food?" she offered. "No," he replied quickly again. She nodded politely and stepped away. As she returned toward the counter, she glanced toward the veteran. Their eyes met briefly. He gave a small nod. Not a warning, just acknowledgement. She understood. Something was still not right. The veteran finished the last bite of his meal and set the fork down. The dog stood again at the exact same moment. The timing made him pause. "Still watching, huh?" he murmured quietly. The dog's gaze never left the booth. Outside the windows, the morning sun had climbed higher, lighting the diner brightly. Inside, customers continued eating and talking, but the quiet tension remained between the veteran, the dog, and the man in the corner booth. The veteran reached for his cane and leaned it lightly against his knee. Not because he planned to stand yet, but because he preferred having it ready. The dog stepped slightly closer to him. Across the diner, the man finally picked up the backpack and placed it on the floor beside his feet. He looked toward the door again, then toward the windows, then toward the hallway leading to the restrooms. The veteran followed each movement carefully. Old instincts whispered quietly in the back of his mind. The man wasn't just nervous. He seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. The waitress walked by again, carrying a tray of empty cups. She slowed slightly near the veteran's table. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. The veteran looked up at her. His expression remained calm, but serious. "Do you know that man?" he asked quietly. She glanced toward the booth. "No," she said. "I've never seen him before." The veteran nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." She hesitated before speaking again. "Should I be worried?" He shook his head gently. "Not yet." That answer didn't fully calm her, but something about his steady tone helped. The service dog suddenly shifted its weight again. The movement was small, but noticeable. Its eyes narrowed slightly as it focused even harder. The veteran felt the leash tighten just a little. That was another signal. The dog had confirmed something through scent. He leaned down slightly. "What is it?" he whispered. The dog remained silent, but its body language spoke clearly. Across the diner, the man in the booth suddenly stood up again. This time he kept the backpack in his hand. For a moment, the entire diner seemed to pause without realizing why. The veteran's eyes followed him carefully. The dog stood tall beside the chair. The man hesitated beside the booth again. Then he slowly began walking toward the hallway leading to the restrooms. The veteran watched every step. The dog's attention followed the man across the diner. And as the man disappeared down the hallway, the dog remained frozen in place, still staring at the direction he had gone. The veteran exhaled slowly. Something was definitely happening. He just didn't know exactly what yet. But one thing was clear. The dog's instincts had not been wrong so far. And whatever had caught its attention inside that diner had not gone away. The hallway leading to the restrooms was quiet again after the man disappeared around the corner. The sound of the diner slowly returned to normal. Plates moved across tables, someone laughed near the counter, and the coffee machine hissed softly again. But the veteran and his dog had not relaxed. The service dog stood beside the chair, still facing the hallway. Its ears were raised and its body looked ready, like it was waiting for the next signal. The veteran leaned slightly forward and rested his hands on the table. His eyes stayed on the hallway entrance. The waitress noticed the same thing when she walked past his table again. She slowed for a moment and followed the direction of his gaze. "Did he go to the restroom?" she asked quietly. The veteran nodded once. "Yes." She looked down the hallway for a second, then back at him. "Your dog still seems focused." "He hasn't changed his mind yet," the veteran replied calmly. She folded her arms for a moment, thinking, "Do you think something is wrong?" The veteran didn't answer immediately. He watched the hallway another moment before speaking. "I think he noticed something unusual." The waitress looked at the dog again. The animal was not barking or pulling. It simply stood in place, steady and watchful. "That dog hasn't taken his eyes off that direction for almost 15 minutes, she said softly. "That's why I'm still paying attention," the veteran replied. Behind the counter, the cook wiped his hands on a towel and leaned slightly toward the waitress. "You're staring down the hallway like something exciting is about to happen," he joked. She gave a small shrug. "Just keeping an eye on things." The cook glanced toward the veteran's table. "That fellow and his dog seem serious." "He said the dog notices things people miss," she replied. The cook chuckled lightly. "Well, maybe the dog smells bacon." But the waitress didn't laugh this time. Her eyes moved back toward the hallway. Still nothing. Back at the table, the veteran slowly stood up. He used the cane carefully, placing it on the floor and pushing himself upright. The dog stepped closer to him immediately. The movement caught the waitress's attention. "You okay?" she asked as she walked over. The veteran nodded. "Just stretching my legs." But his eyes stayed on the hallway. He took a slow step forward. The dog stayed beside him. "What are you thinking?" the waitress asked quietly. He kept his voice calm. "I'd like to take a quick look down that hallway." She hesitated. "You think something might be wrong?" "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But when a trained dog reacts like this, I've learned not to ignore it." She nodded slowly. "That makes sense." He took another careful step forward with the cane. The dog walked beside him in perfect rhythm. Several customers noticed them now. The large service dog moving through the diner drew attention naturally. One of the truck drivers near the window watched with curiosity. "Looks like that dog's on duty," he said quietly to his friend. His friend nodded. "Must be a serious job." The veteran reached the hallway entrance and stopped for a moment. He listened carefully. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. He gently placed a hand on the dog's back. "Stay close," he whispered. The dog's ears lifted slightly. They moved slowly down the hallway. Behind them, the waitress watched nervously. The cook leaned slightly forward from the counter. "What's going on?" he asked. "I'm not sure yet," she replied. Halfway down the hallway, the veteran noticed the restroom door was slightly open. A light inside flickered softly. He paused. The dog stepped slightly ahead of him and sniffed the air. Its nose moved slowly from side to side. Then the dog turned its head toward something else. Not the restroom. The veteran followed the direction of the dog's nose. At the end of the hallway was a small storage area used for cleaning supplies. The door to that storage space was also slightly open. The veteran felt a small knot of concern in his stomach. The dog quietly stepped toward the door. His body was calm but focused. The veteran slowly followed. Behind him, the waitress had stepped closer to the hallway entrance, watching carefully. "Everything okay?" she called softly. The veteran didn't answer yet. He reached the storage room door and gently pushed it open. Inside the small room were shelves filled with cleaning products, paper towels and boxes. And sitting on the floor near the back wall was the backpack. The same backpack the man had been carrying. The veteran looked around the room quickly. No one was inside. The man was gone. The dog stepped forward slowly and sniffed the bag. His body stiffened again. The veteran's instincts immediately sharpened. He didn't touch the bag. Instead, he stepped back carefully. The waitress had now reached the hallway entrance. "What's in there?" she asked. The veteran turned toward her. "The backpack." Her eyes widened slightly. "The one from the booth?" "Yes." She looked past him into the storage room. "But where's the man?" The veteran shook his head slowly. "I don't know." The dog remained focused on the bag. Its nose hovered a few inches away. The veteran gently pulled the leash back. "Leave it." The dog obeyed instantly but did not relax. The veteran turned toward the waitress again. "I need you to do something," he said calmly. "What?" "Call the manager." Her face showed concern now. "Is something dangerous?" "I'm not sure," he replied honestly. "But it's better to be careful." She nodded quickly and hurried back toward the dining area. Moments later, the manager came down the hallway with her. "What seems to be the problem?" the manager asked. The veteran pointed toward the storage room. "That bag was carried in here by a man who was sitting in the diner." The manager frowned. "Maybe he just left it by accident." The veteran shook his head slightly. "My dog alerted to it." The manager looked down at the dog. The animal was still watching the bag closely. "Alerted how?" the manager asked. The veteran spoke calmly. "He's trained to recognize certain scents." The manager's expression changed. "Are you saying that bag could be dangerous?" "I'm saying we shouldn't take chances." The hallway had grown quiet again. The waitress stood behind the manager, watching nervously. "What should we do?" she asked softly. The veteran answered carefully. "I think it would be wise to call the authorities." The manager nodded slowly. "That might be the safest choice." He pulled out his phone and stepped a few feet away to make the call. Inside the diner, the customers continued their conversations, unaware of what was happening down the hallway. But the veteran remained focused. The dog stood beside him like a silent guard. Minutes passed. The manager returned after finishing the call. "They're sending officers to check it out," he said. The veteran nodded. "Good." The waitress looked toward the storage room again. "Do you think that man is still in the diner?" The veteran slowly turned and looked back toward the dining area. His eyes scanned the room. Every table, every chair. The booth where the man had been sitting was now empty. The front door was closed. No one had noticed anyone leaving. The veteran's voice became quieter. "I think he left." The waitress crossed her arms nervously. "But he left the bag behind." The dog remained focused on the storage room. The veteran gently rested his hand on the dog's head. "Sometimes," he said softly, "dogs notice things long before people do." In the distance, faint sirens could be heard approaching the diner. And for the first time that morning, the entire situation was about to become very real. The sound of distant sirens slowly grew louder outside the diner. At first, most of the customers didn't pay much attention. Police cars passed the highway all the time. But the veteran standing in the hallway knew the officers were coming here. He remained calm, his hand resting lightly on the leash of the service dog. The dog stood beside him, still watching the storage room door. Its ears stayed raised, its attention completely fixed on the backpack sitting on the floor inside. The waitress stood a few steps behind the veteran, her arms folded nervously. She kept glancing toward the dining area and then back toward the storage room. "Do you think it's really something serious?" she asked quietly. The veteran didn't answer immediately. He simply looked down at the dog for a moment. "I trust him," he said finally. The manager paced slowly near the hallway entrance. He kept checking his phone, listening for the sirens that were now clearly getting closer. In the dining room, a few customers had begun to notice the strange tension. People glanced toward the hallway where the veteran, the waitress, and the manager stood together. One of the truck drivers leaned slightly toward the counter. "Everything okay back there?" he asked. The cook shrugged. "Probably just a small issue," but the waitress knew it felt bigger than that. The sirens grew louder until finally 2 police vehicles pulled into the parking lot outside. The flashing lights reflected through the diner windows, catching everyone's attention now. Customers stopped talking. The front door opened a moment later as 2 officers stepped inside. The room became very quiet. The manager quickly walked toward them. "Officers," "Thank you for coming," he said. One of the officers looked around the diner briefly. "What seems to be the problem?" The manager pointed toward the hallway. "It's back here." The officers followed him down the hallway where the veteran and the waitress were waiting. When they reached the storage room entrance, the officers immediately noticed the dog standing alert beside the veteran. One officer nodded toward the animal. "Service dog." "Yes," the veteran replied calmly. The officer then looked into the storage room and spotted the backpack. "That the bag in question?" "Yes," the manager answered. The veteran spoke quietly but clearly. "My dog alerted to it." The officers exchanged a quick glance. "What kind of alert?" one asked. "He's trained to recognize certain unusual scents," the veteran explained. The officer nodded slowly. "You did the right thing calling." He raised his radio and spoke quietly into it. Within minutes, another team arrived with additional equipment. The officers carefully cleared the hallway, asking everyone to step back toward the dining area. The waitress watched anxiously as the officers worked. Customers in the diner whispered among themselves, trying to understand what was happening. The truck drivers stood up from their table to get a better view. The cook stepped out from behind the counter, wiping his hands nervously on a towel. The veteran sat down slowly in a nearby chair along the hallway wall, resting his cane beside him. The dog remained standing next to him. "You've done enough," one officer told him kindly, but the veteran shook his head gently. "I'll stay here." The officer smiled slightly. "Fair enough." The investigation team carefully examined the backpack without touching it right away. They used special tools and equipment to check it from a safe distance. The entire diner remained silent. Minutes passed. The waitress felt like her heart was beating louder with every second. Finally, one of the officers carefully opened the bag. Everyone waited. The officer looked inside for several moments before speaking. "It's clear," he said. A quiet breath of relief passed through the hallway. The waitress let out a small sigh she didn't realize she had been holding. Inside the backpack were several electronic parts, tools, and mechanical devices. Nothing inside was immediately dangerous, but the equipment looked unusual and complicated. One officer turned toward the veteran. "Your dog probably picked up on the chemicals from these tools," he explained. "Some equipment has strong scents." The veteran nodded slowly. "That makes sense." The officer closed the bag carefully. "Still, it was smart to call us. Leaving a bag like that behind can worry people." The manager rubbed his forehead. "So there's no danger?" "No immediate danger," the officer confirmed. The tension in the diner slowly faded. Customers began talking again as the officers finished their inspection. But another question remained. Where had the man gone? One officer checked the security camera near the front entrance. After a few minutes, he returned to the group. "He left through the front door about 10 minutes ago," the officer said. The waitress frowned. "Why would he leave his bag?" The officer shrugged. "Maybe he got nervous. Maybe he forgot it. Hard to say." The veteran gently scratched behind the dog's ears. "You did your job," he whispered. The dog's tail wagged for the first time that morning. Soon the officers carried the backpack outside to contact the owner later. The flashing lights faded as the police vehicles prepared to leave. Inside the diner, the quiet morning slowly returned to normal. But something had changed. Customers began walking toward the veteran. One of the truck drivers approached first. "Sir," he said respectfully, "that dog of yours kept everyone safe today." The veteran gave a small smile. "He just pays attention." Another customer clapped softly. Soon a few more people joined. The sound of applause slowly filled the diner. The waitress stood beside the veteran, smiling proudly. "You didn't even know what was in the bag," she said quietly. He shook his head. "No, but sometimes it's better to be careful." The manager nodded in agreement. "You helped us do the right thing." The veteran looked down at the dog again. "He deserves most of the credit." The dog looked up at him with calm, loyal eyes. For the rest of the morning, the diner felt different. Customers shared the story with each other, shaking their heads in amazement. Some took photos of the service dog. Others simply came over to say thank you. The waitress poured the veteran another cup of coffee and placed it gently in front of him. "This one's on the house," she said. He smiled. "Thank you." The dog finally lay down beside the table again, relaxed for the first time since entering the diner. The morning sunlight continued pouring through the windows as cars passed quietly on the highway outside. For most people, it would always seem like an ordinary breakfast place. But for everyone who had been there that day, the memory would stay with them. Because sometimes the smallest warning signs can prevent bigger problems. And sometimes the quietest hero in the room isn't the person at all. Sometimes, it's the dog who refuses to stop watching until everyone is safe.